"Sir, that guitar is not for public handling." The man behind the counter said it the way people say things when the conversation is already over in their minds. Firm, final, polite enough to keep the room quiet, sharp enough to close the door. The man on the other side of the glass did not argue. He did not raise his voice or reach for his wallet. He simply looked at the guitar, a 1959 Gibson ES-335 in cherry sunburst, hanging under its own pinlight like something that had been waiting a long time for the right hands, and then looked back at the man who had just told him no. "I just want to hold it," he said quietly. "Just the weight of it." Richard Calloway had managed Sterling's Fine Instruments on Melrose Avenue in Beverly Hills for 2 years. He had turned away collectors who arrived without appointments, guided session players toward the demonstration models, and kept every museum-quality piece safely behind glass where it belonged. He knew what a serious buyer looked like. The gray-haired man in the worn jacket and simple dark trousers standing at his counter on this cold January afternoon in 1994 did not look like one. He made that judgment in under 3 seconds. It was the costliest mistake of his professional life. What Richard could not see, what no one in that store had any reason to know, was that the quiet man asking to hold a guitar had written one of the most covered songs in the history of recorded music, had organized the first major charity concert the world had ever witnessed, had once stood on stages so enormous that 60,000 people filled every seat, and still the room felt too small for what was pouring through him. He had spent 30 years creating music that reached people without asking permission and never fully left. In 8 minutes, every person in that store was about to find out exactly who they had been turning away. If you've never heard what happened next, stay right here. Subscribe before this story is over. You will not want to miss what comes next. But the story did not begin on Melrose Avenue. It began, as most things in George Harrison's life had begun in those years, with something quiet that other people mistook for emptiness. It was January 1994, and George was 50 years old. He had been 1/4 of the most successful band in the history of recorded music. He had stood on stages so loud that the crowds drowned out the amplifiers, and the band played on by memory alone, unable to hear a single note. He had written something in 1968, a melody that arrived in the middle of a recording session for an album that barely needed another song, and Frank Sinatra had later introduced it at a Las Vegas performance by calling it the greatest love song of the last 50 years. He had organized the concert for Bangladesh in 1971, the first charity concert in music history, when every lawyer and executive in the industry told him it was logistically impossible. He had converted to Hinduism, chanted in temples in Vrindavan, India, and built a garden at his estate in Henley-on-Thames so extraordinary that horticulturalists traveled from distant countries simply to walk through it. That Tuesday morning, he had made himself tea and driven himself, alone, to browse guitar shops on Melrose Avenue. He did this when he needed to think without thinking, not to buy necessarily, not to be recognized, just to be near instruments, to feel different woods under his hands, to hear what different guitars said when you asked them the right questions. He believed every guitar carried something specific inside it, a voice that existed before any musician ever played it. And the only way to find that voice was to pick the instrument up and listen with full attention. Most musicians he knew had long since stopped going anywhere alone. They sent assistants, they called ahead, they arrived with handlers and left without speaking to anyone. George had always moved differently. In a world that spent 30 years trying to make him larger and louder and more visible, he had spent those same 30 years quietly learning to disappear. Disappearing, he had come to understand, was not absence. It was the only way he had ever found anything worth keeping. He pushed open the door to Sterling's Fine Instruments and stepped inside. He had no idea what was waiting for him. The inside of Sterling's Fine Instruments smelled the way all the best guitar shops smell, of old wood and machine oil and something harder to name. something closer to time itself, the accumulated presence of every instrument that had ever hung on those walls, and waited. George stopped just inside the door and let his eyes adjust. The shop was narrow and deeply lit, the kind of lighting that makes expensive things look even more expensive. Vintage guitars lined both walls behind glass. A 1952 Les Paul Gold Top with the original finish intact, a pre-CBS Stratocaster in Olympic white, a row of pre-war Martin acoustics that seemed to absorb sound rather than produce it. Two other customers murmured quietly near a pedal display in the far corner. A young woman named Claire was restocking hardware along the back wall. Richard Calloway stood behind the main counter in his navy suit, white cotton gloves already on, the posture of a man who had decided before you arrived exactly what category you belonged to. George moved through the space without rushing, the way he always moved through spaces that interested him. He looked at the Les Paul without touching the glass. He paused at the Martin row and read the hand-lettered description cards. He was not performing browsing. He was actually browsing, the way someone does when the looking itself is the point. And then he saw it. The 1959 Gibson ES-335 dot neck in cherry sunburst hung at the far end of the center display, under its own separate pin light, on a wall by itself. George stood in front of it for a long moment and did not move. He knew what a 1959 ES-335 was. He knew what original PAF humbuckers sounded like, the specific warmth of Seth Lover's hand-wound design, the way the semi-hollow body caught sustain and held it like a breath held a half-second longer than expected. He knew, because he had spent his entire life learning the exact language of instruments the way other people learned spoken languages, not from books, but from contact, from hours of holding and listening and adjusting until the communication went both ways. He asked Richard if he could hold it. Richard explained, pleasantly, that the guitar was reserved for serious collectors and not available for unscheduled handling. He gestured toward the production models along the opposite wall. George looked at the production models, then looked back at the ES-335. He asked again. Same answer, different wording, same result. Something moved behind George's eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something older than both of those things. A recognition. He had been in this moment before, not in this store, not with this guitar, but in this exact shape of moment, a room deciding what he was before he had the chance to show them. He asked a third time, if this story is pulling at something in you, subscribe right now. Richard spoke the way people speak when they believe information is the same thing as an answer. The ES-335, he explained, was not simply a guitar. It was a documented artifact, hand-built in Kalamazoo, Michigan, in the final quarter of 1959, one of fewer than 200 produced that year with the original dot fret markers, before Gibson switched to block inlays in 1962. The PAF humbuckers, patent applied for, Seth Lover's original design, wound entirely by hand at the factory floor, were both intact, both original covers, neither rewound and neither replaced. The cherry sunburst finish carried almost no fading, which meant the instrument had spent the majority of its life indoors, protected from stage lighting and direct sun. Provenance traced back to a Memphis session musician who had worked recording dates at Sun Records and RCA through the early 1960s. Sold the guitar in 1971, after which a private collector in San Francisco had held it untouched for 22 years. Sterling's had acquired it 3 months ago. Richard paused, with the particular pride of a man presenting his best argument. Since the day it went on display, he said, no one had touched it. He said this as though it settled something. George had been listening without expression. Then he asked a question that Richard had not prepared for. The Sun Records sessions, George said. Do you know specifically which ones? Richard paused. The documentation refers to general rhythm work, backing dates, nothing traceable to a named artist. George looked at the guitar again, because if that guitar was in the room when early Elvis cut his first sides, or when Johnny Cash recorded there in '59, or when Roy Orbison sang Only the Lonely into a microphone for the first time, It wasn't simply present in the room, it was part of what the room produced. Note by note, that changes what the instrument is. He was not arguing. He was not performing. He was saying precisely what he believed, in the same tone he used for everything he believed. Quiet, unhurried, completely certain. Richard had no prepared response for that. He was composing one when Claire noticed something. She had been at the back wall for the last several minutes, sorting strap hardware with the automatic efficiency of someone whose hands knew the job well enough to free her mind for other things. She had been half listening to the exchange at the counter, the way you half listen when something in the room is slightly more interesting than the task in front of you. And now she was fully listening, her hands completely still, because there was something in the man's voice, not the accent exactly, though that was there too, something Northern English worn smooth by decades of California, but something in the way he spoke about instruments, the specificity of it, the reverence that didn't perform itself, that was pulling a thread she couldn't yet identify. She opened her phone. 16-year-old Marcus had come in 40 minutes earlier for a packet of guitar strings. He was still there, standing near the vintage pedal display, not looking at the pedals. He had been watching the man at the counter with the focused stillness of someone whose brain was running a calculation the rest of him hadn't caught up to yet. He typed a search. He waited 4 seconds. He looked up from the screen slowly, the way you look up when the ground has shifted under you, without making a sound. He crossed the floor and turned his phone toward Claire, without saying a single word. She looked at the screen. She looked at the man at the counter. She looked at Richard, still mid-sentence, still explaining, still completely wrong. Her face changed the way faces change, when ordinary becomes extraordinary, in the space of one breath. She walked to the locked display case. She took the key from her lanyard. She lifted the 1959 Gibson ES-335 in both hands, the way you carry something that has been waiting too long to be carried. Richard saw her moving. Claire, that instrument is not. She was already walking. She carried the guitar across the floor and held it out to George Harrison with both hands. Not to the counter, not toward Richard. Directly to George, the way you offer something to the person it was always meant to be with, the way you correct a mistake that should never have been made. George looked at her for a moment. She met his eyes without apology, without explanation, without making what she was doing about herself in any way. She simply held the instrument out and waited. He adjusted the strap, the motion so automatic it had no weight to it. 50 years of muscle memory compressed into a single unhurried gesture. He settled onto the wooden demo stool beside the front window, where the January afternoon light came through the glass in long, pale bars and lay across the cherry sunburst like something deliberately arranged. He did not ask for an amplifier. He did not explain what he was about to do or prepare the room for it in any way. He placed his left hand across the neck, closed his eyes for the length of one breath, and began. Not the Abbey Road version. Not the version Frank Sinatra had sung in Las Vegas while calling it the greatest love song of the last 50 years. Not the version that had been covered more than 600 times in countries George had never visited by musicians who had learned it before they learned anything else. He played the version that existed before any of that, the searching original, the sound of a young man in a London studio following something his hands understood before his mind did. Not yet certain if it was finished, not yet certain if it was even good, simply moving through the melody the way you feel forward through a dark room you have never been in before. The unplugged ES-335 filled the store, not loudly, the way light fills a room, completely, without announcing itself. Richard Calloway had not moved from behind the counter. His white-gloved hands hung at his sides. Every layer of professional composure, the suit, the practiced explanations, the 2 years of certainty about who deserved what, dissolved in under 30 seconds, and what was left underneath was something much younger and considerably more honest. A man who had once loved music before he learned what it was worth. Across the room, Marcus was no longer pretending to look at anything. Tears ran down his face without drama, without sound, the way tears come when something reaches the actual person underneath all the armor. The afternoon light held completely still. Subscribe right now, because what George said when he finally put that guitar down is something nobody in that store ever forgot. George played for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He ended on a single sustained note, let it breathe until it dissolved completely into the silence around it. And then he sat still for a moment, with the guitar resting across his knee. He looked at it the way you look at something that has just told you something true about yourself. Then he stood, reset the strap carefully to its original position, and carried the ES-335 back to Claire. Not to the display bracket, not to Richard, to Claire, who had seen him clearly when no one else in the room was paying enough attention to look. "She sings," he said, "just that." He reached into his jacket, produced a worn leather card holder, and placed a single card flat on the glass counter. "I'd like to buy it. Whatever paperwork is needed." Richard picked up the card. He read it. He set it down with the deliberate care of someone handling something they are not entirely sure they deserve to be touching. When he looked up, every trace of the professional composure he had carried through 2 years of managing this store was completely gone. What remained was simpler and considerably more human. "Mr. Harrison," his voice came out younger than it had sounded all afternoon, "I owe you an apology. I couldn't have known." George stopped him with a small, calm raise of one hand. "You were protecting the instrument," he said. "That instinct was correct. The only thing you misjudged was whether you could determine a person's relationship to music from the outside." He paused. "You cannot. Nobody can. Music doesn't live on the outside of a person." He took the card back, turned it over, and wrote 4 words on the blank side. He placed it back on the counter without explanation. Richard looked down. "Listen first, always. G.H." Richard Calloway left Sterling's Fine Instruments 14 months later. He told his colleagues he wanted to go back to playing. He joined a small jazz quartet in Santa Monica that performed Thursday and Saturday evenings at a restaurant 2 blocks from the water. He never made significant money from it. He made something that money had never successfully replaced. Years later, a music journalist writing a small piece on independent instrument dealers asked him about the moment that sent him back. He did not mention a record or a concert or a personal revelation. He talked about a Tuesday afternoon in Beverly Hills when a quiet man in a worn jacket asked 3 times, without raising his voice, for something he should have been offered the moment he walked through the door. "What I remember most," Richard said, "was not the playing. It was the patience. He never told me who he was. He simply waited until someone in the room was paying enough attention to see him clearly. I have thought about that almost every single day since." He worked Los Angeles studio dates through the late 90s and into the following decade. He never told anyone what he had witnessed that afternoon. He kept it the way people keep the things that change them, quietly, privately, as something that belonged entirely to him. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001. The 1959 Gibson ES-335 he purchased that afternoon was later donated to a music program for underprivileged youth in East Los Angeles. They still have it. They still play it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe now. A new story every single week. Don't miss what comes next.